So, we are dealing with scientific writing. So, scientific writing. The purpose clearly is to make the ideas that we have generated reach the reader. So, that is the basic idea. The results that we have got, the experiments that we have performed should very clearly reach the reader, so that they can use it. And in the writing of a paper, as I said, the title is the most important thing, the abstract is the next most important thing, and then comes the importance of the introduction. So, now we come to the actual body of the paper, in which the first section is the intro. Now, in the introduction, the reader would expect to find answers to the following things, and therefore, the writer has to put these in the introduction in an appropriate way. That includes so in the introduction, you have to state the problem. That is being tackled in that paper. State the problem. Now, stating the problem would mean that right up front. That means, the first paragraph, in the first paragraph the reader will expect to see what the problem is all about, what the paper is all about, and therefore, the problem has to be stated in at least the preliminary form in the first paragraph, and in more refined form somewhere down the introduction section, but at least in the first paragraph the reader should find what it is all about, the problem that is being attacked. After you have stated that this is what I am trying to find out, you have to tell the reader what is already known. So, what is already known on this issue, or the background material, and that is contained in what is known as literature survey. Now, writing the literature survey is again a bit difficult, because you have to decide upfront which audience you are addressing to, and depending on that you will have to go to different extents of detailing. If you are writing for a knowledgeable audience, knowledgeable means knowledgeable in that particular area of research, then you need not talk about the sort of basics of that area, but if it is meant for a general audience, you have to talk about the basics of that area. So, where you start the literature survey depends on the what kind of audience you are expecting. If you are talking, for example, on the phenomenon of superconductivity, you might start with the first observation of superconductivity early in the last century, or you can talk about the relatively later developments on superconductivity, especially the theory of superconductivity, which happened in the later part of the last century. So, depending on the audience you might start, but the point is that when you end the literature survey, the reader should have a very clear idea about what is already known, and then you have to state what is not yet known. I will come to that, but when you are talking about what is known, you have to weave it as a narrative, as a storyline, so that it is comfortable to read. The narration proceeds in a way that sort of follows the development of ideas. Somebody proposed a hypothesis, somebody else tested the hypothesis and found it to be incorrect. Another hypothesis was proposed by somebody, somebody tested it and found that he or she cannot eliminate the null hypothesis. So, the hypothesis was strengthened and so on and so forth. You weave it as a narrative, and at each point you have to cite who has done this work and how to cite this, the stylistics of the citation. I will come to that later, but the literature survey is a prime place where you refer to the earlier work, you cite the earlier work. Okay. Now, citing the earlier work and talking about what is already known is not optional, it is mandatory. In any paper, even in the briefest possible papers, you have to talk about what is already known and then prepare the ground to state what is not known. And therefore, the next point that you have to state is what is then on the basis of the literature survey, then you have to establish that what is not yet known. So, after having told what is known, then you have to tell that this is what is not yet known, and that is what is my subject of investigation in this paper. Thus, you establish the motivation of this is known, on that basis I can see that this is unknown, and therefore, this is my subject matter. Now, when you state what is unknown, as you know, all research is essentially trying to answer some question. It is a question, and therefore, when you state what is yet unknown, you have to state it in the form of a question whose answer is yet unknown. So, question means something that starts with which, when, where, how, and ends with a question mark. So, a question. The most common error is to make statements rather than questions, like in this paper we study the property of something. This is statement. You are not stating which question's answer is yet unknown. And when you are saying that in this paper we studied something, then some part of that is known, and on that basis some part is unknown. You have to state very clearly what is yet unknown, and that needs to be stated in the form of questions. This question's answer is not yet known. And then you have to state how do you propose, how do you rather how did you proceed to obtain the answer, your methodology. So, these are all questions. Now, you may have performed an experiment, you may have performed some simulation studies, you may have obtained a derivation, you may have proved a theorem. So, what you did in order to obtain the answer to that question, what method did you follow, that needs to be very clearly stated. Okay. So, what methodology did you follow? So, this is actually question of methodology. And since there are various techniques and methods available in science, experiment, theory building and all that, you have to state what you did. Now, then briefly state the results. Do not keep stating the results for the conclusion section. There will be a section, the conclusion out of the paper, but the reason that we include a brief statement about the principal outcome of the paper, the result, is that by reading the introduction, the reader clearly knows what to expect in the paper. So, in this paper we show that kind of language we use, and show that means the reader immediately expects that somewhere down the line he would be convinced that this result is true, and therefore, he would check whether the method followed actually derive that result or not, and so on and so forth. So, it is necessary to state briefly the results, not in detail, but briefly the principal results. And then you have to state the organization of the paper. The organization of the paper means how you have broken it up into sections, each section dealing with a specific aspect, some section on say deriving the model, the simulation, the results. So, each would be a different section, and how you have sectionalized the paper, that has to be stated. So, its language would be that in section 2 we introduce the system model, in section 3 we simulate the system model using certain parameter values, in section 4 we present the results, so on and so forth. So, which means that after reading that, the reader knows where to expect what. This is necessary because if you notice your own reading style, you should expect the reader's reading style to be the same. And what is your reading style? What is everybody's reading style? We jump around. We jump around. After having read the introduction, sometimes we simply go to the conclusion and find out what is the conclusion out of that, and then maybe we go to the relevant section that are to our interest. So, rarely we read from the beginning to the end in one go. We jump around. We look at some pictures, okay, this figure is of interest to me, so I will come back to that. So, if you want to jump around, you should know how to do that. So, the organization of the paper, that paragraph helps in doing that. So, these are the things to be included in the introduction. Many people write the introduction at the end. After having composed the rest of the paper, they start to write the introduction. I normally do not write that way, because for me it is sort of a wholesome story that starts with the introduction, and therefore, the development of the thought, development of the idea that starts from the introduction and goes, there is a continuity, and that might be broken if the introduction is written at the end. So, I personally prefer to write in one go, after having formed a complete idea about what is to be presented in the paper, but different people have different techniques of doing that. I am not really disregarding the other possibility, but it is just my choice. So, these are the things to be stated in the introduction. Well, after you have put down the introduction, comes the middle part of the paper. Middle part of the paper means the other sections that are there in the paper. Now, the other sections, for example, there would be a by the way, there are some papers in which, in most papers, we put the literature survey in the introduction, inside the introduction. Right after introducing the problem to be attacked, we state what is already known, and therefore, it comes there. But in some rare situations, this literature survey part may be a bit longish. You might need to, for practical reasons, need to tell the reader what is known, and that might be a bit longish. In that case, some people separate the literature survey as a separate section called background, and they present that way, but that is relatively rarer. Normally, the introduction contains the literature survey, and after that we need to present the hypothesis and the methodology of testing the hypothesis and parameters used and results obtained. all these would come one after the other in the middle part of the paper. Now, while writing the middle part of the paper, you have to understand, you have to keep in mind the reading habit of the reader. As I said that readers normally jump around. After reading the introduction, some people go directly to the conclusion and find out what the conclusions are, and then come back to the relevant portions. And in the relevant portion, the main important things are the figures, tables, charts, equations. So, these are sort of landing grounds. That means, after having jumped around, the reader normally goes here, there, and looks at what is interesting, and then if he is convinced, he or she is convinced that it is worth reading the whole paper, then he or she will read the whole paper. And therefore, the writer has to keep this in mind, that the reader might jump around, and so there has to be enough landing grounds that the writer sort of directs the reader to jump around in the places where the writer wants them to jump around, where the writer wants the reader to land. Say a particular figure is the central to this paper, that means this conveys the basic idea. So, the organization should be such that while the reader jumps around, he or she will inevitably land on that figure. So, the writing should be such. In this part, you have to state what the mathematical model is, you have to state the assumptions, state the parameter values. So, all that has to go into this middle part of the paper. But in the middle part of the paper, the most important thing are the figures, because a figure can convey in very precise, accurate way what 10 paragraphs cannot. If you write a lot, much more is conveyed in just one figure, if the figure is properly thought of and composed. So, figures are most important things in a paper. I am thinking of scientific papers in which there would normally be figures. And therefore, I will spend some time in discussing the figures, because many people make mistakes in producing figures. Firstly, if any data, primary data or simulation result or results of say a theoretical development can be presented as a graph, always do that. Always do that, because that conveys the idea to the reader in a fraction of a second what 5 paragraphs would not. So, it is important to make pictures, make figures whenever possible. A paper should be dominated by figures rather than by text, unless the content of the paper is such that there cannot be any figures, there can be only text. Now, some possibly known, but people do mistakes, that is why I have to say, whenever there is a graph, there are axes, and the axes have to be marked. Okay. And I have seen that many times people write, for example, here temperature, sorry. That is it. No, you have to also state the unit in which it is there. So, like this, within bracket the unit should be there, or maybe say velocity within bracket meters per second. So, this is the right way of labeling the axis. So, it should not say, for example, if you want to write say magnetization, so magnetization you should not simply say amperes per meter. No, it is magnetization within bracket amperes per meter. That is the right way of labeling the graph. Okay. And for example, the magnetization and something on this scale. So, the point is that these are written in letters, and after you have produced the figure, it will be resized when it is put into the paper. And when it is resized, mostly it is sort of shortened, the dimensions reduce, and as a result of which these letters become so small that they cannot be read. So, the rule of thumb is that these letters should be of such a font, such size, so that after reduction their size is one size smaller than the size in the text. And normally we use in the caption one size smaller font, and this should be of the same size after reproduction, that means after reduction. So, these should be produced accordingly. Remember, normally we produce the graphs using some graph plotting program like GNUplot, like Origin, like MATLAB, Mathematica or something like that. They normally would not produce this in sufficiently large sizes. So, you have to do something to tell the graph plotting program to write the axis markings in sufficiently large sizes, and every program has that facility and you have to use that. Just plotting the graph, whatever you get you put in the paper, that is not the right way. So, these have to be in sufficiently big size. Then in the figures you are putting some images, and images come in different formats. So, if you talk about image formats, there are basically two. One is called the raster graphics, and the other is called vector graphics. A raster graphics image is essentially a collection of dots. So, when you enlarge it, it becomes blocky, while a vector graphic image is essentially the locations are joined by certain curves, and as a result of which if you expand it, if you enlarge it, it does not break, it does not become blocky. That is why publishers normally prefer vector graphics images. And programs like MATLAB, like Mathematica and things like that, they can produce vector graphics images. So, wherever possible you should try to produce vector graphics images. Now, what are the raster graphics formats? For example, in Windows as well as in Linux and Mac, you have both these formats available in different programs. For example, in Windows, let me erase this part. In Windows, you have Photoshop, you have similar programs, Paint. These are raster graphics, and in Linux you have say GIMP, image manipulation program, GNU image manipulation program, and there are various other programs like that. And in vector graphics, again I will talk about Linux and Windows. You have say Visio, CorelDRAW, etc. What I am writing are not definitely not exhaustive, I am just giving examples. Xfig, and the usual graph plotting programs can export in both these formats, both raster graphics as well as vector graphics. And raster graphics formats are, for example, BMP, JPG, GIF, PCX, PNG, and so on and so forth. These are all raster graphics programs, raster graphics formats. And the vector graphics formats normally are say PS, PostScript, or encapsulated PostScript, or PDF. These are normal vector graphics formats, but these can also take raster graphics images. So, these are actually usable by both techniques. Now, there are some which are lossy and there are some which are lossless in the raster graphics images. In the raster graphics formats, there are some which are lossless and there are some that are lossy. For example, lossless includes BMP, TIFF, PNG, and so on and so forth. Lossy includes say JPG, GIF, etc. Lossy means depending on the fidelity that you use while saving an image, you can set the fidelity in say JPG image, you can set the fidelity and accordingly it will it might incur some losses. If you set it 100%, then there is no loss, otherwise there will be some losses. In general, the losses are such that on screen they are not very apparent, but if you want to print in a very high quality mode, then the losses would be visible. So, if you are using only raster graphics images like this, if you are using only raster graphics images like this, then normally as I said, it might be a bit blocky, and the way to avoid that is to create the figure in relatively large size, so that when reduced in size, the blockiness goes away. So, relatively larger size, but if you do it in a relatively large size and plan to reduce in the final reproduction, then lines will become thin, and thin lines do not show well, and therefore, you have to create the picture with relatively thicker lines. So that even when they are shrunk, they are compressed, the line widths are comfortable to the eye.